When you're filling it with these fill-in words and short phrases, it's saying to the audience, they don't know what they're talking about. They're having difficulty in recalling.
Good morning. Great to be together again and see all of you once again. Most surveys I look at say Americans' top fear is presentations and public speaking, along with spiders and snakes and ghosts and clowns. And so Mike didn't take on ghosts and clowns, but he took on public speaking and presentations. So Mike Bailey's with us, and he's going to spend a little time talking about the work that he's done over the years with presentations. But I want to go back earlier in your career and talk about some of the things you learned along the way, Mike, starting your career on another continent, and then what brought you to the colonies uh, to further your career, and how that turned into the work you do today.
Amen. Thank you, Randall. Good morning, everybody. Well, it's a long and very detailed story, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because otherwise we'd take up the whole half an hour or however long we want to talk. I started work at the age of 16, did an apprenticeship, a 5-year apprenticeship. And at that time, I couldn't see what 5 years looked like, because in terms of my memory, that was 50% of what I could remember. But I did an apprenticeship in radio communications, electrical engineering, electronics, and eventually came out with a degree in wireless and electrical engineering. Designed many complex radio communication systems. And it got to the point where I could see the salespeople were earning a lot more money than me, and yet they were getting me to talk to their clients because they didn't understand what it was that they were selling. So I thought, nah, I've got to change. So I moved into sales. And I spent 30 years, 35 years in sales. And it completely changed me. And one of the things that I had to do, because I did a presentation back in 1979, it was 32 pages, handwritten, 35mm slides, dark room. I couldn't see the audience, but someone came up to me afterwards and said, Mike, slides were great. Might need a bit of help in how you actually talk and communicate with people. Well, that took about 6 or 7 years before I actually did something about that, and went through training in public speaking, presentations, and very importantly, how does the brain work? How does it need to receive information in order that there's a fairly reasonable chance that they're going to understand what you're talking about? And shortly after all of this, I got headhunted, moved to another company, and they had a wireless technology that was very, very interesting. It really excited me. And they said, there's only 2 places we can potentially sell it. We can't sell it anywhere at the moment because radio communication equipment has to be approved by the regulating authorities in those countries. They said, well, Britain's being very slow, but America seems to be moving. How would you like to go to America for a couple of years and get this off the ground? Thank you. Yes. So 5th of January 1993, I landed in America. I had no idea about America. Coming from Britain, we learned all about the colonies that we had, however you want to describe it, helped them with their work and their culture, and didn't do anything about America. I knew a lot about Canada, but nothing about America. And I had no comprehension of the size of this country. That came a bit later. So I brought this new wireless technology here, and I had to spend a lot of time traveling the country, telling people, a lot of technical people, a lot of users, people who looked at how these things worked and made recommendations for it. And people would come up to me after I'd done a presentation and said, Mike, I've never seen a presentation like that. What do you mean? Well, I understood it. Duh. Isn't that the purpose? I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. Go and look at some of the breakout groups. So I went to some breakout groups and I saw what they meant. Very knowledgeable people, but not a clue how to communicate. We're going to talk a little bit about why that happens. Anyway, the time came to leave that organization and start my own business. 1st of April, April Fool's Day, 2001. And here I am today having a ball. I love doing what I do. I don't have a career anymore. I have a calling. Good morning, everybody. Randy, do you want to continue for a bit or just me continue?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. You're on a roll. You're doing great.
Okay, all right. 74. Okay, Mike, 74 what? Apples, oranges, radios? No, 74%. Yeah, okay, we're getting closer, but 74% of what? This is the point. When we talk about things, and particularly about numbers, a number by itself is meaningless, as I've just demonstrated. It has to have a measurement. But even then, there is still no meaning to that number. 74% of what? It's actually 74% of millennials and Gen Zs. I don't know if any of you are on the call today who would put themselves in that class, but they would prefer to communicate digitally rather than real face-to-face, real opening your mouth and communicating. It's a scary thing. I know what it's like to stand in front of 300 people and not be able to get a single word out. But I learned how to do it. And then I learned by experience. Well over 1,000 real world presentations. So why don't people understand you, me? What is it that stops them? Well, J.B. Shaw, back in the earlier part of the 20th century, said, the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's actually taken place. And how many times do we think that? There's a lot of talking going on, but is there communication happening? If we look at what is a communication, it's a transfer. It's a transfer between the person who is doing the communicating and an audience, an individual. But it shouldn't be a monologue, a one-way communication. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation. And how do we actually have a conversation? Too many people just talk. I know, stand in a group of people and you can pretty well guarantee that one person is doing much of the talking. And what's it all about? It's all about themselves. When we're doing a presentation to a group of people, it's not about you. Oh, sorry. No, it's not at all about you. It's about your audience, your people. How do you connect with them? Many people think, let me ask you all a question. Just put your hand up. Who has been outside America and to a country where they don't speak English normally? Anybody? Yeah, quite a few. So let me ask you the question. How did you communicate? Yeah, a lot of those people in those countries, they do speak a form of English, but plenty of places they don't speak English. They don't understand you. You don't understand them. So how do you communicate? Well, maybe we do signs and gestures and pointing and actually get a picture off our phone these days. You see, the brain doesn't work in words. Oops, sorry. Revelation time. The brain does not work in words. It works in images. And there's two different ways that this communication process happens. In terms of receiving information, that information needs to be structured. It needs to be structured logically. Because if it's not structured, the brain doesn't know what to do with it. You see, when we receive information, when we hear, see, touch, smell, all the senses, when that information comes to us, the brain goes into a great processing mode. It's looking in its database called experience. It's looking in its database for something that either they do know what it is or it's something similar to it. So it's looking for a relationship to see whether you can gain an understanding of what's being communicated, whether that's in words, whether it's in movement, whether it's in pictures, images. So how do we get an image into someone's mind? Well, we're getting pretty spoiled now with Zoom and other technologies as well. It's amazing what we can do, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. You can join groups like this and learn a lot of things. When I first came on the call, there was 3 or 4, and then half a dozen, then 8 or 10, talking very much about personalities and how do you measure that. Measuring, if you can measure something, you can manage it. And I lost a contract fairly early in my career, a pretty big one, to an engineering company. And I went back in and said, well, what happened? Why did I not get the contract? And they said, well, you didn't have a means of measuring. Engineering, measuring, duh. So I spent 3 days designing a measurement system with my engineering background where you analyze down to very small details, very almost insignificant details. You can look at. So I dissected what a presentation is, how does it happen, what does the audience need to see and hear, and devised a measurement system. And it's very accurate. I can tell you the percentage of an audience you are going to convince with your message. Yeah. But you see, when you can measure something, you can manage it. So if you know those areas within the communication that aren't working too well, and nobody's perfect, and when you don't know, you don't know. But when you know what those things are, you can work on those, give that more time, more energy, more thought on how to do it. Because what I've done is split the communication up into 3 fundamental areas. I look at the content and how is that put together. I look at the structure of the whole message, and then I look at how do you deliver it. And I have 29 different points that are all measured. Now, it's like many things. If you're driving a car, if you wind the window down, that doesn't have too much effect on your driving, hopefully. But it's still part of the process. So some things are more important than others, and that I've allocated a weighting system. How much does this element impinge on all the others and on the complete communication? And I put all that in, I measure on a 1 to 10 scale, not objectively, but subjectively. What is the audience seeing? What's the audience feeling? What are they understanding? And giving that a 1 to 10 measure. Very, very subjective. Very hard and intense to do too. So I'm just looking at all the names and pictures. Again, just put your hand up if you've not just given a presentation, but you've been terrified in giving a presentation. Have you ever been through that process? Yeah? Thank you for being honest. Appreciate it. I think most of us, if we've never had a fear in that situation, we're probably fooling ourselves. And the only reason is that we don't understand what's happening. And if you don't understand something, it's very difficult to control. So when you understand, you can control. And communicating in the live environment is one of the most fun things you can do. It really is wonderful. So why do we need to understand all of these elements? Well, we need to be able to control them. It's rather like, I draw an analogy of driving a vehicle. I don't know how many of you can remember that first day you jumped in a vehicle. Yeah, I'm going to drive this. I'm going to drive this at 40, 50, 80 miles an hour, guys, 100 miles an hour. No, maybe it was a stick shift. 3 pedals. That's strange. I've only got 2 feet. What do I do? And it can be absolutely terrifying. You actually start to move. You're in control of this beast, this thing that is a huge weapon if it's not used carefully. Change gear, and now it gets really terrifying because we've got to steer, we've got to control the speed. How do we brake? What's around us? The things are coming at us so fast, and the faster we go, the more things and how quickly, and therefore how little time we have to actually assess what's going on. I liken giving a live presentation to driving a vehicle at about 120 miles an hour. You can't be thinking of anything else, and you've got to be totally in control. You've got to be looking forwards, sideways, backwards. What's your speed? How close am I to the vehicle in front? So many things you've got to be thinking about. It's a heightened awareness. Unless we can reach this heightened awareness level, we're going to miss things that we need to be in control of. So I'm just looking at my notes, which I've got standing up right by the side of me. So let's have a look at some of the elements of communication. And I divide it down into what I call the 3 V's. The 3 V's. The vocal, the verbal, and the visual. Now, if we take the verbal, that's the words. How much do people remember of the words? And this might be quite difficult for some of you. And I hear all sorts of percentages. It's about 5%. It's tiny. It is such a small part of communication that we can get tied up in the words. I'm not saying the words aren't important, of course they are, but they are such a small part of an actual communication. Then we move on to the vocal. That's how you say it. I hear so many boring talks because we haven't yet learned how to spread out the intonation in our voice to make it more interesting. If you don't have a passion for what you're doing, can I suggest get out and do something that you do have a passion for? We get one life. We get one life. And the older you get, the more you realize that. I'm just 5 weeks away from my 78th birthday. I don't understand retirement. Why would I want to retire? I love doing so much what I do in helping people to do what they thought they couldn't do. Anybody can do this if they want to. Anybody. Every one of you can do it. So, okay, we've looked at the verbal, we've looked at the vocal. We're up to 40%. What's that 60%? It's the visual, the image. What's our body language doing? What's your audience's body language doing? How do you read that body language? When you read body language, you get to understand so much more what a person is thinking, what they're feeling. The body never lies. Unfortunately, what comes out of here sometimes isn't always what we're feeling, what we're thinking, but the body never lies. When you can read body language, yeah, it tells you what that person is thinking. Very, very important. What about attention span? Attention span. What do I mean? How long can you keep someone engaged? So just have a think about this, particularly those who have kids, and I've had 5 kids in my life. What's the average attention span of a child? And yeah, I know it depends on what they're doing, what the situation is, all those things, but averages is where you take all those factors, put them together, and you come out with a number. Well, the average attention span of a child is about not hours, not minutes, seconds, 5 seconds. So what's the average attention span of an adult? We don't learn too much. Yes, some people, it actually goes backwards. But across the population, it's about 7 seconds. 7 seconds. When you start a communication, you need to start it with what I call the grab. You have to get their attention right up front because you've just got that 7 seconds. That's all. How did I start today? Yeah, I gave an insight into me. But then when I started the talk, what did I start with? I started with a factoid, 74. And that's all. See, I get your attention. What the heck is Mike talking about? And going on from there. So there are a number of different ways in which you can start a talk that will get their attention. You can start it with a factoid, as I did. You can start it with a question, but an open-ended question, not a closed question. If you can answer yes or no to a question, it's a closed question. And you're not engaging people. Very important to learn how to engage your audience. So how do you engage an audience? If it's all one way, if it's all tell, and that this environment where you're all muted and you can't come back with comments and discussion points. It's a very strange way compared with doing it in the full live environment. But getting that feedback, getting people to think, if you ask them their what, where, when, why questions, you can't answer yes or no to it. You get a depth of brain engagement. What did you have for breakfast this morning? What the? What are you asking that for, Mike? Well, it's a question. Did you have to drive to your office? I have 30 steps to walk down to get to my office. Yeah, don't do too much exercise. But when you ask questions, you will get your audience engaged in what you're talking about. Now let's talk a little bit about the voice. The voice. It's such a critical area of the communication. One of the things that I teach in my courses is the why. When you understand the why, you can control things. So what happens when you open your mouth and sounds come out? We create sounds in a particular way that hopefully have a meaning to people. How are you doing a bit English? Come on. How many of you could understand that? But if you went north of the border from England into Scotland and you went to Glasgow, you would hear that type of speaking. You haven't got a clue what they're saying. It's a different language. And this is the point that I made earlier. How do you communicate with people who don't understand your language? Every industry has its own language, and Americans just love their acronyms. TLAs, FLAs, three-letter acronyms, four-letter acronyms. You know what it means, but does your audience know what it means? You use words that your audience knows. Kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, terabytes. What do they all mean? You may have heard them, but you haven't got a clue what they mean. Now, when you open your mouth and you created a sound, and we create a similar sound, or we're trying to create a word, and because of accents and dialects, the actual sound comes out. We think it's perfect, but others, they're not used to hearing a word pronounced like that. Now, by the time it gets to their ears, what has happened? Well, we have air, and what we're doing is vibrating air molecules. And those air molecules, they bump up against each other and transmit that sound. So by the time it gets to their ears, it's not what left your mouth. So you're hearing from this distance here and the vibration in the bones in our head. But that's not what your audience hears. Those of you who've maybe recorded your voice and listened to it, that's not me. Ah, yes, it is. But by the time it gets to your audience, it's changed so much. It actually takes a physical, measurable, easily measurable time to get from your mouth to their ear. And in that time, many things happen. Bounces against walls, the ceiling, the floor, tables, wherever. And effects happen to distort and change that sound. So what can we do about that? Okay, Mike, fine, super, excellent, yeah. No, you're an engineer, but come on, get to the point. what we have to do is when we release this sound, we have to create the sound as accurately as possible. See, when I came to America, I didn't know what water was or butter. It's not what I learned. I learned water and butter. Enunciating clearly, particularly the consonants. The vowels are very much the shape of the mouth, but the consonants are where your teeth, where your tongue, all those things that provide a much harder sound. The t, the s, ch, g, f. Those sounds, unless they are enunciated clearly when it's about to leave your mouth, by the time it gets to your audience, a f can sound like a ch, can sound like a s. And therefore they don't know what it is that you are trying to say, what you are trying to communicate. So the enunciation of words is very, very important. Did you hear how I said important? Most Americans will say important. No enunciation of the T at all. Important. People then have a chance of saying, yeah, okay, I think I understand. I think I can hear that word, and therefore I know what it means. How do we breathe? Well, I'm breathing Mike, I'm alive, I'm vertical, well, sitting down, but yeah, but are you breathing the right way? Are you breathing in a way that you can continue a sentence, that you can project your voice? How do you project your voice? It's not shouting. It's all to do with the volume of air that you're putting through your voice box. Learning how to breathe deeply and keeping your lungs full of air is so important. What about the intonation? The roller coaster, I call it. It's like adding color to a picture. If you look at a black and white picture and then you look at the color version of it, I dare say you will see much more information in that color picture than in the black and white one. Sure, Ansel Adams, if anybody knows anything about photography, he did some of the most amazing black and white photographs. But he spent so much time in his darkroom where his prints were created in getting the right tonality, the difference between the blacks and the whites and all the gradations in between. He spent so much time in getting that right. It's just the same with your voice. No, I haven't lost connection. How do you use a pause? Why do you use a pause? There are so many aspects in the communication environment that you've got to be aware of at a very heightened level. And if you don't have passion, it's going to be very difficult. Now, what about all those, what I call verbalized pauses? They're pauses which you've filled with a sound. Like, you know, no, I don't know. That's why you're doing the speaking. Don't tell me I know. And yet we do these without even realizing that we're doing it. And then there's the all tell. It's non-stop. No questions are asked. Those open-ended questions to get the engagement. Make sure your voice isn't boring and it's a pretty well a monotone, and you might get something from this morning. And no, get some excitement in there. Show people that you love what you do. I suggest most of you would count yourself as being a leader. I went to a talk by Pat Williams, the coach of the Orlando Magic baseball team. Very, very good talk he did locally a few years ago. And he went through the qualities and skills of a leader. And the first thing that a leader needs is a vision. But then the second most important skill, most important quality is communication. If you can't communicate, and it's not just the talking, that's 5%. If you can't communicate, there's no way you can be a real leader. Very, very important. It's got to be clear, it's got to be concise, it's got to be correct. I could go on for hours, but I think from the time that Randy said that I've got to actually speak, but coming close to that. So Randy, do you want to open up a question and answer session?
Yes, that'd be great, Mike. So if you have any questions, type in the chat and we will unmute you. You know, a lot of folks, Mike, when they are speaking and they're using a lot, it seems to stem from nervousness.
Yes.
How do you coach people to weed that out of their talk?
Comes back to a level of confidence and understanding what's happening in the process, not what you're talking about, not what you're showing slides about. It's understanding the process and why you need to do certain things. That it comes back to the nervousness. So many people, and I'm sure it's none of you, but you can't fill all the time with sound. There has to be a time when you actually stop. And having the pause silent is way more powerful than filling it with nonsense. And you can only do that when you have learned, first of all, that you're doing it. It's amazing how many people, and I use video recording so that you can see yourself how your audience sees you. It's amazing how many people before seeing that video will say, no, I didn't do those things. What? I don't say you know. Okay, I didn't have time to edit this video. Let's have a look. And when you see yourself as your audience sees you, yeah, first time it's a little bit difficult, but it's something that I recommend you do, because unless you understand how your audience is perceiving you, you're never going to crack this. I'm terrified of doing this. So why don't you do something about it? I had to. As I said, I know what it's like to stand in front of a large audience and not be able to get a single word out of my mouth. I was so terrified because I didn't understand the process. It's a process. This is why how my engineering background comes in, being able to analyze that process. Back to you, Randy.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I don't know if she can unmute still, but she talked about using. So Elizabeth, can you speak there now?
Can you guys hear me?
I do. Yes.
Okay, good. Had to do some technical adjustment. No, I was going to say that I am a serial even in just normal conversation. So it gets worse when making a presentation. And I try to catch myself and just fill it with silence. It's better than an
Yes.
or grab a water bottle and just take a moment to sip, anything to sort of distract from the because I think it takes the audience down, as you said, with either confidence or they think you lost track of your point. So
And that is what comes across. When you're filling it with these fill-in words and short phrases, it's saying to the audience, they don't know what they're talking about. They're having difficulty in recalling. If you're trying to read a script for a presentation, and yes, there are times when part of your talk might require that. But if you're doing that all the time, that's exactly how it comes across. People want to see you who you are. Did you realize, Elizabeth, that in your little chat just then, and I appreciate that, thank you, you said,
I did not.
No, and that's exactly the point I was making. You don't know you're doing it. And the reason you don't know is because you haven't got to this heightened awareness level, that you are aware of everything in the environment, what you're doing, what you're saying, what you're about to say, what the audience is doing, are you connected to them, all these things. And until you've reached that heightened awareness level, you can't control it. But I teach you how to reach that heightened awareness level. Let me ask you all a question. When does a sprinter start sprinting? Nobody done any sprinting? Yes, Kurt.
I'm guessing, I'm not a sprinter, far from it, but I'm guessing, what, 50 meters into a race?
Months before. Preparation. If
Trick
they're
question.
not fully prepared when they're in the chocks waiting for the gun to go off, they're never ever going to win that race. When that gun goes off, they're at 95%, and they hold that last 5% to get out and hit that string, whatever it is that was there, to win the race. This is so similar. You've got to start off, you've got to hit the ground running. That's why getting that grab initially, how do you do that? It sets the scene, and you might buy a few minutes, and that's all. You've got to continually keep going back in and grabbing their attention. Keeping up those open-ended questions. Turn a tell into a rhetorical question. Sure, if you've got a large group, you can't at that moment get an actual response back, but you watch their body language. It tells you what they're thinking. Good question, Kurt. Thank you.
Let's go to Frank.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. Good to see you.
So, yeah, you just want everybody to know you've helped me a ton, Mike. Like you, Elizabeth. Well, she can't. Oh, yeah, she can hear me. Just can't hear her. I a lot, a ton. And I don't know if it's because I raised two daughters or not, but I say right a ton. Like, right. My wife, I've had recordings that I've looked at, previous recordings. I say right like every other word, like, hey, Mike, blah, 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 right? Right? Well, maybe it's not right, but anyway, you've helped me really eliminate that or minimize it. On my wall in my office, I have don't say right. And I'm looking at it all the time. Right, Mike? Anyway, you've been a lot of help. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Frank.
Kurt actually had a question a minute ago about cross-border, and when you were talking about how do we speak as Americans, I think Drew typed the same thing I was thinking. We just yell slowly and give them time to learn English. The louder and slower we yell it, the odds are they have a chance to study. But Kurt, you want to go to your question?
Sorry about that. I apologize. Having been around the world, that's the question. There's body language. And to me, the answer to your question earlier was just be a more intent listener and put others before self. And that helps communication around the world. So, and I would always tell folks, I don't want to be the ugly American, right? But from a non-American perspective, what's our biggest problem as Americans? How can we communicate better across cultures and across the globe, so we don't get that ugly American syndrome?
It really comes back to one of the things I said fairly early on. You've got to put your audience first. Regrettably, many, not all, many Americans have learned how to do this. But when it's about you, that's the problem. You've got to put your audience first all the time, because it's not about you. And really, and yes, I've traveled quite a lot of the country as well, the world as well. I've been to 4 different continents and many different things in culture. I found a document online called The 4 Principles of Interpersonal Communication. Fascinating. In terms of interpersonal communication is inescapable. It's irreversible. Yeah. It's left your mouth. You can't grab it back. It's a bit like when we put something on the internet. You can't get it back because it's gone somewhere and someone's keeping it. It's complicated. And it's very contextual. And that contextual is one of the hardest parts because of the understanding of what a word means. It means something to you, could mean something totally different to someone else. I had the greatest difficulty when I first came to America because so many words that are used in Britain and the same word is used in America, but having a totally different meaning. I was trying to describe to people about what radio waves are. And have you ever seen a radio wave? And everybody says, no. So I have this thing in my hand, okay? And I'm shining it around and I'm saying, see, this torch is shining a light. And there's these blank looks all through the place. One brave soul says, Mike, that's a flashlight. But you see, to me, that's a torch. We don't use flashlights. A torch to you is a flaming stick. It's a totally different thing. And it's so easy to use words that we know and understand and expect our audience to understand. That's why we have to know and understand our audience and use their language.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kurt.
Let's go to Chris.
Hey, Mike. Hey, good to see
morning,
you.
Chris. Good to see you.
I hope I look as good as you when I'm 78. I'll say that.
It's all about attitude. It's all about attitude and positive thinking.
Exactly. I totally agree. Hey, one of the things I remember you and I talking about was this thing of with following people's eyes whenever you're in a conversation and they look up to the left or the right stuff. And I thought that was really fascinating. I'd heard that a couple of times before, but I don't think I really had somebody explain it to me. And I'm a person who I kind of talk. I'm very visual, and I tend to talk in stories, I guess. And I know that I don't naturally look at people. I have to think to look at people sometimes when I'm talking to them. It's just a real interesting conversation. So would you want to speak to that a little bit for the rest of the group?
Sure, I can. It's something called neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. NLP. You can look it up online. But emotions are connected to eye movements. emotions are connected to eye movements. So when someone is talking about something that's emotional to them, you can ask them the question, what's the most exciting thing you've done in the last week? And in that moment, in that split second, you watch where their eyes move to. If they move up, they are visually dominant. If they move to one of the sides, they're verbally dominant. If they move to your, so I have to think about this because your left and down, they're kinesthetic. If they move to your right and down, they may not be telling you the full truth. So it's a very powerful way of being able to understand, how does a person need to receive information? What's the best way? If their eyes went up, and there's a difference between that and that, but I'm not going to go into that. But if their eyes go up, you've got to be talking in pictures and stories a lot. If they move to the side and they're verbal dominant, they love words, but don't speak too quickly. If they're kinesthetic, you better talk real slow and never give them an instruction manual. They've got to do it.
Thank you.
I think Elizabeth has a great question. No, actually, that's what she's going to ask about, is having a great question. So go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I feel like I'm dominating all the questions. So, but thank you for indulging. It specifically had to do with what I feel like is a recent trend, but that just shows my age. With this, so there we go. I'm going to be so self-conscious about that. Anyway, the tendency now to start an answer to any question with, that's a great question. And I understand it brings the audience in, it makes that connection with them. It starts to feel, it can feel at times a little condescending or inauthentic. And I know that there are other tools. It feels like a tool, but I just thought I would get your take on that.
I was going to say, yeah, that's a great question, because it is. But did you realize what I was doing with the people who have spoken? I've acknowledged their question at the end, not at the beginning. I've gone straight into answering the question right up front, but then given them the kudos after I finished speaking. That's a way of overcoming it, because yeah, I think, as you said, I certainly find it very condescending, because when a speaker is saying, oh, that's a great question, to me it says they haven't got a clue how to answer this, and they're trying to buy some time to think about how they're going to answer it. But those are all things that I teach in my training. Thank you for your question.
Let's go to Dan.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for the talk this morning. It's very interesting. I know early in my career, I did some work with Toastmasters at Hallmark, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know when I was making presentations and stuff, later in my career, I had young people come up to me and say, hey, can you give me any advice? And I said, join Toastmasters. It's a safe environment. You get a lot of good feedback. And because, you know, in your daily workplace, you probably aren't going to be making enough presentations to get enough practice. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
One of my clients said to me, he said, I spent a year going through Toastmasters. I've learned so much more in a single day with you, Mike, than I did in a whole year at Toastmasters. I'm not knocking Toastmasters. Toastmasters has a place, but it will only potentially take you to a certain level. A very important part of my teaching is coaching. I spent an hour on a single sentence with someone because so much can go into every individual sentence. How do you say it? How do you pause? How do you emphasize? What is it? The word? Is it the syllable? Is it the first syllable? Is it the last syllable? How do you use a pause? What's the timing for that pause? Before and after, in order that word stands out, because every sentence has a key word. And the other words around that sentence are all fill-in words. People, if you're lucky, might remember the key word. They certainly, at least most of them, wouldn't remember exactly what you had said. So Toastmasters, yes, it's just one way of doing that. But if you really want to get to the top in the shortest possible time, find a really good trainer and coach. It's like playing an instrument. It's a skill. It's not a talent. It's a skill. You're not born with the ability to be a great speaker. I certainly wasn't. I had to learn. It's no different to playing the violin, which I used to do, playing the guitar. It's a skill. So thanks for your question, Dan.
Mike, one of the things I found over the years that was ineffective to me sitting in an audience is when presenters read their slides. I can read them myself. So I don't need you to read them for me. How do you coach people to use slides effectively?
It's a very important thing, and the slide has to be completely synchronized with what you are saying at that moment. If your slide contains sentences, you'll get an from me. Because of that, as I've just said, you'll be lucky if they even remember the key word, let alone all the words. And if you've got to read it, it says to the audience, do they really know what they're talking about? Did they produce this talk, or did someone else produce it and they're just reading it? Put it on automatic, play some music, go and have a cup of coffee. Don't insult your audience. You have to know what you're talking about. So never, ever, 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 as Churchill would say, read the slides. It's insulting to put your back to the audience.
Who's that Churchill guy?
Who's that Churchill guy?
That was a cultural joke.
I know, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. What an amazing guy. There are so few that can see the macro, the big, and the micro, the little details. Churchill could see both. Very amazing guy. Amazing.
Last one from me, Mike. You, when you and I talked before, you said most people waste that first 7 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That everyone already knows you're glad to be there.
That's right.
What are some of the other things people do that waste that opportunity?
They do a great long introduction into who they are because they're so important. This is all about me. No, it's not. Get them excited, get them engaged at that moment. You'll see so few presentations like that.
Well, great job, Mike. A lot of good pointers and reminders here that I know we all can take and use sometime during our week.
I appreciate your time and thank you for asking me, Randy. Certainly enjoyed all our chats that we had beforehand. And anybody who wants to get in touch with me, just look at how I spell my name, B-A-Y-L-Y, BaileyPresentations.com. You'll find me.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it. I've been working on this for a long time.
Hey,
And I had a panic attack, like speaking about 25, 30 years ago. And I wasn't able to speak in front of two people for a long time. And so I went through this whole process of talking in front of one or two and then three or four and still hating it, to the point where I can just talk in front of people now, which is exactly what you were saying. That's amazing when you can get to that point
that's
where
right.
you're confident enough about what you're talking about and you're good enough at speaking that you trust that you're not going to have a panic attack.
That's a good question. As I say, I can take you from petrified to professional. Takes about 2 days now. That's
Oh,
all.
I love it.
That's all.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone have a great weekend. It was
Thanks,
all.
Mike. Very good.
Thank
Excellent.
you. Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.